Hello and welcome back to another episode of Creedle. Today I am joined by Jeremy Christiansen, who is a lawyer and more recently an author, and more specifically an author of a religious memoir called From the Susquehanna to the Tiber, a memoir of conversion from Mormonism to the Roman Catholic Church. We're going to dive into this book today. I had the pleasure of reading it last week and this week. Really fascinating stuff. And Jeremy, I'm excited to dive into your journey. Welcome to Creedle.
Thank you so much, Zach. I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. No, I'm really excited to have you. I know we connected on Twitter a while back, and I saw that you had this book in the works at Ignatius. Fans of the show will know that I love Ignatius Press. A lot of the book reviews and book author interviews that I do are from Ignatius, just always cranking out stuff. Whenever the Ignatius Press catalog comes in the mail, my wife just bookmarks it for me because she knows I'm going to want to look at it. And this is the latest. Now, this is just out as of like a week ago, right? This is pretty new.
Yeah, it's brand new. I think they've just started fulfilling orders here in the last week or so on Amazon and from Ignatius, and also from I think other kind of major book retailers. You can get it.
Yeah,
but, yeah, it's just out. So
great. Well, Jeremy, you were born and raised in what the book jacket describes as the small Mormon town of Blanding, Utah. And then you went to, I think, Utah State University after serving a 2-year mission in Argentina. And then to I've got to look at my notes here, the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, I actually went to Southern Utah University, not Utah State.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
For undergraduate, but so Southern Utah University in Cedar City, and then law school at the University of Utah.
And then after that, you find yourself in a legal career, but now have moved across the country and are in the greater DC area with your wife and 6 children, right?
6 children. Number 7 will be here. The due date is 1 month from today. So
congratulations. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. We were a bit behind you guys. We were expecting our 5th in March, but yeah, maybe awesome. One day, 7. Well, that's great though. So now living in the DC area as a Utah transplant. As someone who's from the West, I've spent a good deal of my time in the West. If I add up all the time that I've lived in Colorado, it actually is a plurality of my life. So it's the place that most feels like home to me. I obviously don't live in Chicago, in Colorado now. I live in Chicago. As someone who is from the West, do you find yourself missing it, or do you really have you been a thriving transplant in the Atlantic region?
Yeah, I think both. I am a Westerner, and it is very hard to rub that out. It just stays. It's hard to get rid of it. The East Coast has a different culture, a different vibe about it, and that just shows up in the way I am and the way I do things. But we have really loved it out here, and have we've been here a little over 6 years, and just enjoy it. I think part of it now, as I'm sure we'll get to, we have a really special a Catholic community that we belong to. Our parish community is very strong. The greater DC area is a very interesting place to be as a Catholic, right? There's a very strong Catholic presence here, and a lot of important aspects of Catholicism happen in and around DC. The pro-life movement is very strong out here, and those sorts of things. So we really enjoy it. I suspect we'll be here for the long term.
That's great. I'm glad that you haven't been too sick for mountain or desert landscapes or anything like that. So
no, yeah, we make it back. We make it back to visit family and such. And I certainly do miss seeing the stars. Coming from a place as small as where I was born, 3,000 people, give or take, very middle of nowhere, and I do miss the night sky as I grew up looking at it, which looks nothing like the sky out here. So
I should have done this before, but I did not actually look up where Blanding is, so I just did, and it's in basically the far southeast corner of the state of Utah, way down there.
Yeah, it's in the Four Corners area where Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico all meet at 90-degree angles. It's about an hour and 15 minutes south of Moab, Utah, which is pretty
beautiful,
right?
Yeah.
And about an hour and 15 minutes north of Monument Valley, also really, well-known and beautiful place. So absolutely stunning country. A wonderful place to have grown up, and my parents still live there. I still have a brother who lives just north of Blanding. So
Nice. Well, if we can, without spoiling the book, obviously, because people need to go buy the book. I mean, I think the title of the book gives away the conclusion. You did, in fact, cross the Tiber. You did convert. But can you give a brief sketch of your journey, starting probably from? I mean, we can probably even just caveat sort of you had a rebellious youth, and you go into that in great detail in the book, which I think is very helpful. We don't need to do that for this interview, I don't think. But if you could maybe start from sort of your fervent faith when you had this sort of, I don't know, we might call it a conversion or a reconversion experience in high school, all the way through where you find yourself today. Just maybe, a 5-minute summary of that journey.
Yeah, sure. So I had something like a reversion or a conversion to my Mormon faith, to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that I've been raised in. My parents are very devout, good Mormons, and raised a very devout family. And I really kind of experienced a strong conversion to the LDS faith right around the time that I had to make a decision about whether I was going to serve a 2-year mission. So as a lot of people know, you see missionaries out there on the street with the white shirt and the black name tag and a tie and all. And I knew that was sort of coming up, and it was right around that time that I experienced a conversion, as you might call it. And it was really powerful. It was really important and really set the trajectory of my life in a lot of ways. And I think sort of building from that, a lot of people experience a mission. You go for 2 years and it becomes very formative. And I would say that is definitely the case for me. Certainly some people have a negative experience, but I couldn't call my mission a negative experience at all. It was extremely formative and faith promoting, in the sense that, when you go around and you spend all day, every day, with half a day off a week, randomly approaching strangers everywhere you go, on the bus, down the street, knocking on people's doors, trying to preach to them this message, it has an impact on you. And the LDS Church is pretty open. There's sort of a saying, they'll say, the most important convert on your mission is you. And it really, you're out there, you're young, 19 years old. When I went to Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I was in and around the capital city and kind of the major metropolitan area to the north. And then I also spent 9 months in the Patagonia, at the very southern tip of the country, which was part of our mission for administrative purposes. It was just easier to get down there, given where the domestic airport was. And, you're there with a companion. You spend all your time with them. You're just sort of preaching and you're testifying. You're giving people this testimony that in the Mormon context is sort of really fundamental to understand. That in this context, the Mormon Church teaches essentially that you can know that the truth claims that the LDS Church makes are true, that the Book of Mormon is scripture, and that Joseph Smith was really called as a prophet of God, by asking God, and God is going to give a sort of manifestation to you that you feel in your heart is true. And it's a very powerful experience. We can get into that, of sort of what I make of that now a bit later. But, you have this experience, and then you, within the framework of Mormonism, have a kind of really certain knowledge it's hard to tell people how much you believe it. And I will frequently say, you don't believe Mormonism, it's true. There's a level of certainty about it that is, again, hard to communicate to people who haven't grown up in that context. And going about every day telling thousands of people, ultimately, right, by the time you finish, that I know that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the only true church on earth. It's guided today by a living prophet, that Joseph Smith was called as a prophet to restore Christ's true church to earth. If the Book of Mormon is true, it will change your life. Doing this for 2 years really reinforces that. And interpreting the experiences that you have on your mission as God sort of perpetually guiding you all the time also has a big influence. And this idea that you get a testimony from God is not just limited to gaining, knowledge about the church's fundamental claims. The LDS Church conceives of itself as being built on continuing revelation, that God is continually speaking to not just the leaders of the LDS Church, but to everyone who's a member of the church within their sphere to guide them. Now, at some level, that probably sounds, vaguely correct and accurate, that, God guides us. But within the context of Mormonism, it's really specific. And kind of this idea, the same sort of set of feelings that one has that are associated with receiving a testimony are the same sorts of things that members of the church seek out, that would say, I should do this. I should marry that person. I should go to this university. And as a missionary, I should turn down that street right there and go knock on the doors on that street. It's this, very deep sense of being at times minutely guided by God in everything that you do. And this experience is kind of, built up because these events sometimes, cash out, that sometimes you felt like you should go down this or that street, and you met someone, and you end up talking with them, and it's great. And if things go south, well, it wasn't their time will come later. But if things work out, it's this sort of reinforcing mechanism of God gave me a revelation and told me to go there. And this person was prepared to receive the truth and got baptized,
So like a confirmation bias at work, basically.
Yeah,
it works out. So therefore,
definitely,
yeah,
in a really powerful way. And so this is sort of occurring all the time. And, by the time you leave a mission, you're a lot of people are very, very, very convinced. And I certainly was. And I was happy. It wasn't like I was, like it was destructive, right? I think most people will concede, Mormonism teaches a pretty clean and healthy life, and has some really good basic values and family values and those sorts of things that are good as far as they go. I returned home from my mission in 2008, and believing the church's teachings about marriage and family. I met my wife at a young adult event shortly after I got home, and we started dating pretty quickly, and we got engaged really quickly. We were married. We met in February of 2008. We were married September 6th, 2008.
Wow.
In the Los Angeles, California temple. It's there on Santa Monica Boulevard. My wife's from Southern California. And we set about living, a happy Mormon life. We had kids right off the bat. We had kids immediately. And, Mormonism relies really heavily on the participation of ordinary rank and file members. So congregations are not led by a paid priest. It's the bishop of a ward. So a ward would be maybe something like a parish. And the bishop, like the pastor, it's just, it could be your name. My dad was the bishop when I was young. It could be your plumber. It could be whomever. And so positions in the Sunday school and these sorts of things are filled voluntarily. You're called. The bishop will call you in and say, I felt impressed by the Holy Spirit to extend you a calling to be the nursery teacher, right? Like to watch over the young ones, during when all the grown-ups are at Sunday school during the set of meetings that LDS people go to on Sundays. And so, we were both heavily involved, and that was kind of the example my parents had set for me, and same with my wife. I served in a number of leadership positions from pretty young. I served in a bunch of leadership positions as a missionary, up to the point of kind of the highest one that you can have as a missionary, which is called the assistant to the president. And when I got back, I served in a bishopric, which is like the bishop, and he has two counselors. And so I helped run a ward when I was like 22 and was going to school, doing undergraduate. All this is going on, and life is, pretty well happy. It's stressful. We're having children and just living life. And I would say that while in retrospect, I can occasionally identify maybe a little fissure here or a crack there, certainly nothing seemed that way to me at the time with respect to my faith. And it wasn't really until law school that those things started to really come out. And part of that, could be because of the nature of law school, right? It's a lot of time spent thinking very critically about everything, about, every argument that, you read a case, and every argument that gets put forward, you spend a lot of time dissecting it and thinking about what assumptions underlie that argument and testing those assumptions. And you get a fair amount of skepticism from law school. And there are sort of a couple of things that happen at this time. I kind of had a bit of a personal spiritual crisis that didn't really have anything to do with, Joseph Smith or learning more about Mormonism or anything. It was just it was under a lot of stress. I was serving in an elders quorum presidency. I was a law student. I was overly ambitious as a law student, I think. And, there's a lot of stress going on. And a leader in the church had given me a blessing, which is sort of, they lay hands on you and pronounce what's supposed to be kind of like a prophetic blessing from God. And some real specific things got said to me that seemed right, that seemed just the same. It seemed right, just like I had a testimony, just like anything else I had felt that really felt right. And that just did not happen. And it caused a lot of cognitive dissonance, really, really strong. I had a bout of depression at that time. And so, in that sense, I'm sort of vulnerable with respect to all that going on, and feeling a little bit disappointed in God. Like, why did you kind of have this happen to me? This is difficult to understand. And at the same time, this is so, from 2011 to 2014 is when I'm in law school. There's a lot going on in the world of Mormonism at that time. It's pretty important. The internet has become unavoidable for the LDS Church at this point. 20, 30 years ago and more, if you wanted to know about the early history of the LDS Church, you had to go to a library somewhere and check out an obscure book. It's not like Mormon history is, the topic du jour or on the New York Times bestseller list or something. It's a kind of a niche area. And but with the rise of the internet, this information is becoming very widely available to people. And I'm in Salt Lake City, which is kind of a curious place to be. The presence of the church there is hard to avoid. It's hard to avoid in conversations with people. And it's hard to avoid in an intellectual atmosphere like law school, where some contingent of the student body are Mormon and some contingent aren't. And everyone has very strong feelings about the LDS Church. And, you started to hear at this time about there were kind of large numbers of people resigning from the church, enough that it was kind of making news. There were some leaders of the church discussing this. There was talk about, how historical and doctrinal issues were driving some people out of the church. There were there were some high profile excommunications that happened. A fellow named John DeLynn, who has a really popular podcast called Mormon Stories, was excommunicated in a pretty high profile way. I think the New York Times wrote an article about it. There was a woman named Kate Kelly, who was part of a feminist movement pushing for women's ordination in the LDS Church. She was excommunicated. It was also very kind of national news. And all of these things are going on, and I'm starting to meet people in my spheres who kind of who are faithful Mormons in terms of, going to church and everything, but they kind of like hold unorthodox views about Mormonism. And that kind of started me down the path of all of this is going on, and me starting to read a little bit of these materials. I knew some things, but not. The church does a pretty good job, or did a pretty good job, of warding members off from digging too deep, at least prior to that time. And, I had a moment at some point where this confluence of factors, I let myself ask, what if it's not true? And in a serious way. And I think it's easy for people to kind of abstractly posit, allowing themselves to think something isn't true or to think a particular thing. But I had a real moment where I said, I'm open to the idea that maybe it's not true. What if it's not? What would that mean for me? And wouldn't I want to know?
Can we pause here and unpack that a little bit? So up to this point, you had the reversion in high school, end of high school, whatever. You do the 2 years in Argentina, really convinced of the truth of it because you have this deep conviction, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that it's true. And it's not simply because you believe the words you read in the book. It's because you have this inner conviction, like you said, that it's true. Come back, meet your wife, marry your wife, college, law school. It's there that you start learning how to construct an argument and perhaps deconstruct an argument, learning how to investigate things and apply logical principles to truth claims. And at the same time, you start seeing the church sort of, what would be what's a defensive term I'm looking for? I don't know, batten down the hatches, or I don't know, fill up the moat, whatever.
A little bit of damage control, a little bit of reckoning, of trying to get out front in terms of historical issues and issues about the church's doctrine that are leading some people out of the church, and they kind of make a move to get out ahead of it. In particular, with the publication of a series of official essays that they post on their website, a little, not surreptitiously, but certainly not with a lot of fanfare. But they start posting essays that concede as true things that were a little shocking to hear the church say are true. Things that you heard rumors about this kind of stuff as a kid or whatever, or in high school. But there's a bit of a sense of like, well, those are anti-Mormon lies,
right.
Or you don't, I had heard, or you sort of yeah, Joseph Smith was maybe involved in some kind of treasure digging at some point, but like it was some youthful indiscretion, and that's kind of it. To turn to then see an essay that's like, Joseph Smith and his family believed extensively in the folk magic and occult that pervaded their time period, and were pretty serious practitioners of it. And a lot of the concessions, it's just sort of like, whoa. But these are the things that, people told me.
Right.
At least
these were the lies I heard as a kid, and now the church is conceding them to presumably get out ahead of them or whatever. Yeah. So you're seeing all this, and you, as you just described, you've arrived at a place where you have allowed yourself to really question, is this true, and be open to the answer, right?
Yeah.
If we can peel back the onion on that specific thing a little bit, because your book was actually helpful for me, especially in understanding the importance of this this like witness or this testimony, this moment where in the eyes of the Mormon. And by the way, you say this at the beginning as well. When I say Mormon, I'm obviously not being pejorative. I'm just sort of using the common term. I mean, LDS member could be used interchangeably. I think now the term Mormon has sort of fallen out of favor, as you say in the beginning of your book, but it wasn't always that way.
Yeah.
So,
it's there's been a push in the last couple of years to adopt sort of a preferred nomenclature, but it's cumbersome to say members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day
exactly.
Saints.
Exactly. So suffice it to say, we are not being pejorative in saying that, certainly. But it was helpful to me to read that because I had this experience with my wife, this encounter with a couple of Mormon missionaries in our hometown earlier this year. They had run into my wife outside the library. My wife had our 4 kids with her, and they were like, "Oh, hello," very pleasant to my wife. Got her number. Wanted to get together for dinner, or I think wanted to get together to just talk with us. And so we invited them to our home for dinner, and proceeded to try to share with them about our Catholic faith and why we believe what we believe. And they shared with them about their Mormon faith. And when they couldn't refute anything that I was saying logically, they came back to they gave us a copy of the Mormon Bible, and they came back to, you just have to read it for yourself and ask God
that it's true.
Exactly. And I mean, this obviously you've probably said that line a lot as a missionary, but to them that was the ultimate signal of its truth or falsehood, is that when they had read this, God had told them it was true. Yep. And she said, I have no other way to describe it other than that it is no, I have this core conviction that it is true. And at the time I just thought that's kind of a weird, strange missionary tactic, and I don't know how effective that is. I read your book and I was like, oh, that's it. Like that's part of the Mormon sort of epistemology, is this witness of the Holy Spirit. So talk to me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it really is. That's something I think really came out as I was writing the book, trying to figure out, when you leave, there can be a tendency for certain people, and there were certain people in my life who will ask, did you ever really believe? Did you ever really have a testimony? And I was just shocked that someone could ask me that, because I believed so much. I just can't even to this day communicate to anybody else how much I knew it was true. And so, you start to go back and think about this concept. And to me, that emerged as kind of it's definitely one of the major themes of the memoir, that is kind of the fundamental building block of Mormonism, is the idea that there are certain truths, that primarily being the truthfulness of the claims of Mormonism, of its theological claims, that are to be known in a special way, in a way that's different, that's not really known through our reason, but is known through a feeling. And this feeling is described in Mormon scripture in the Doctrine and Covenants, which is one of the sets of Mormon scripture, that says that when you pray that God will cause your bosom to burn, that you'll feel that it is right within you. And you're taught, from very young that that's what you're looking for, that you're looking for some kind of experience that makes you feel inside, that things are right, and that you feel that it's true. And the way that I describe it, the best I can, is to say it's sort of a confluence of two things at the same time. One, some set of abstract proposition in the mind. Joseph Smith is a prophet of God. At the same time, as this overwhelming emotional sense of well-being. And I talk about in the book that it's not something that is uniquely felt by members of the LDS Church. You felt it. I think every human being alive has felt it, and examples are pretty easy to come by. That when you watch a movie and you see somebody do something heroic, and you just have that feeling, you choke up, and you just feel good and right with the world. That's really the sense that is being communicated. But it's that sense when it coincides with, you're reading the Book of Mormon. And for me, I was in a kind of a really distressed time. I had a lot of tough questions, and I opened the Book of Mormon one night, and I read some passages, and they just said, I just read them, and they just said exactly what I needed to hear. It was like click, and I burst into tears. I just had this overwhelming emotional sense of well-being. And there are many experiences like that through the life of someone who's LDS. But, my own view and theory of this is that it's because we're taught that that's the way that you figure out these fundamental truth claims. And an interesting part about it is, I'm not a expert on philosophy or anything, but it does resonate sort of strangely with postmodernism. And there are some, I think I cite these in the book, but there are some recent talks by one of the high leaders of the LDS Church who says, no one can disprove your testimony.
Yeah.
And it's a little ironic because I don't think, the LDS Church would ever sort of intentionally, link arms with postmodernism or postmodern thought. But this idea that the subjective experience is this undeniable experience and it self-defines truth, right? Is very, very close to what is going on there. And that, speaks to why it can be kind of impenetrable to logical arguments. And on top of that, people are taught that, logic is one thing, but like if your logic is telling you that the Book of Mormon's not true or that Joseph Smith's not a prophet, then you disregard that and you go with what, God has told you. And it's not that it's, heresies have something true about them, which is what makes them appealing. And I think that, there is truth to the fact that there are things, for instance, that are supra-rational. So one would say that the inner life of God and the Holy Trinity is not something we can know through reason. It's something that God has to reveal to us,
right,
and is still beyond our comprehension. But the way that Catholic teaching thinks about this is, well, of course, the doctrine itself is logically coherent. But Mormonism posits that there are things, special, theological truths that God reveals directly to us through our emotions that are true, notwithstanding reason, contrary to reason. And I think, I think that's sort of a big difference between those two approaches.
Yeah, I think your point about postmodernism is a really important one here. Behind me on the bookshelf, one of the books I have there is Carl Trueman's "The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self," and he in a great ingenious way just illustrates how in our postmodern world, the self has become the only reference point for identity and for all of reality. And so that's why we have this language of, your truth in our language. Like there's prior to 1950, your truth didn't really mean anything to anybody. But now people say your truth and they recognize, oh, that's something that's true for you, even if it's not true for me. When that's just really an absurd idea that's just completely postmodern, because it is centered on this idea of people sort of being their own reference points. Yeah. And so your point is interesting because what I hear you saying is that actually there's this at least parallel to sort of postmodern epistemology in holding on to the Mormon faith, and you emerged from your Mormon faith then sort of, I guess, you certainly rejected the Mormon faith, but did you also reject that postmodern idea? And the reason I ask this is because as I was reading your memoir, what I expected to read in the memoir was that you were Mormon, and while you were Mormon, you started to encounter ideas from the Catholic Church and started to read Catholic theology. And eventually you decided, oh, the Catholic stuff is true, the Mormon stuff is not, I'm going to become Catholic. What I actually read is you basically abandoning Mormonism, realizing this is not true. And then there's this delay, there's this gap period where you're not really sure how to identify. You start sort of, I don't know, thinking about like Reformed Mormonism, I think it's called, or you start sort of dabbling in those waters, and eventually you land in Catholic waters. But I was surprised to see that sequence of events. And my question for you here is, did you sort of abandon the postmodern stuff then? And maybe that's why your story was not like so many others that I hear, even from my friends who are ex-evangelicals. I obviously didn't grow up Mormon, so most of my childhood friends were evangelical Christians. And so many of them, Jeremy, even today, have abandoned their evangelical growing up and have embraced this sort of like, I don't know, this moral therapeutic deism, maybe,
Yeah.
or some sort of universalism, because they've rejected key tenets of their evangelicalism and sort of have abandoned, thrown out the baby with the bathwater. I don't love that expression, but you know what I mean, right? Like they just they throw it all away. So how did you get to this point where you didn't throw all of religion away? You didn't find yourself just sort of like a disgruntled agnostic, universalist or something, and instead you found yourself open to Catholicism?
Yeah, so that's a pretty wild story of how it all happens, or at least bewildering to me. So I do want to make one point of clarification. This Mormon view of epistemology certainly predates the rise of postmodernism. I just think it's a very close parallel.
Yeah.
But I think that what I left out of Mormonism, my big kind of lesson was it just doesn't matter how I feel about anything. How I feel about things is not the guide of whether it's right or wrong or true or false. That was sort of my big lesson. It just doesn't matter. People can feel all kinds of things about all kinds of things. And it does not have any bearing on it, because there were things I felt so strongly were correct, and it was based on feeling, that were not. I spent all this time doing reading about Mormonism and Mormon history, and came to say, these claims are just not tenable. There are a number of good, reasonable explanations of the evidence of who Joseph Smith was, what he was doing, what the Book of Mormon is. But none of them are the narrative that served as a precursor for me to have a testimony in the first place. And once one is familiar with them, I don't think necessarily that one would ever get that feeling. For instance, just as an example, and I promise I'll circle back to the question of kind of the interregnum of how I make it from leaving Mormonism and coming to Catholicism, that, it's people, you get to this point where, like, if you heard, you're just an ordinary person, weren't raised in the LDS Church. If you heard that Joseph Smith received a revelation that he was supposed to marry a whole bunch of other women, including women already married to other men, including some underage women, that's all you probably have to hear for you to make up your mind, right?
Yeah.
Or if you were to say, Joseph Smith, he had these golden plates that he found. An angel showed him where they were. He buried them in the ground, and Joseph Smith gets them out. Some people claim that they got to see them, but, the angel took them away, so no one gets to see them anymore. They're gone. Most people, it doesn't take much for them to be like, well, that's not true.
Yeah.
Right. But that's not the story necessarily of how it's kind of crafted and told. And so those presuppositions and that kind of narrative that the LDS Church taught served as a precursor for me to think, well, yeah, this story could be true. And then you have this experience. So then you unpack all of that and you learn all of it, and that all falls apart. And, why did I not stop believing in God? I can only say it's by God's grace. I really don't have much of a great explanation for it.
Mm-hmm.
I still believed, but it was very identifiable as something like moral therapeutic deism, which I think just speaks to the extent to which that kind of belief has infiltrated every religion in America, Mormonism, Catholicism, evangelical Protestantism, what have you, that, I was kind of like, look, I just don't know. I still think God's there, and I experienced God through Mormonism, and I don't really know what to make exactly of the person of Jesus. And, am I in any position to say that that's the only way to, go to heaven? No way. And I'm just going to live and let live. And that's fine with me. And I will kind of, craft my own set of beliefs. I'll make, kind of a cafeteria set of beliefs. And part of that was because while I didn't believe in Mormonism anymore, I was married. I had 4 children. My wife was very, very much still Mormon. And that was very, difficult for her to deal with that. And we had children, and I was the one reneging on, the deal here. Our faith was incredibly important to us. And, I felt obligated morally to just keep going to church to help, corral the kids, essentially, right? She's got 4 little ones, and that's not easy. LDS
For
Church
sure,
at the
yeah.
time was a 3-hour block of meetings.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah,
Wow.
I think it's now down to 2, but it was 3 at the time, and it's a big ordeal. So I was still going every week, but wherever we would go when we moved from Salt Lake to Las Vegas, we lived in Las Vegas for a little bit. We would move places, and I would just tell the bishop, like, look, I don't believe any of this. I'm perfectly happy to even have a calling if you want. Like, I was like a Cub Scout leader, just give me something that I don't have to tell people that I think Joseph Smith's a prophet or anything like that. And if you feel comfortable with that, I'm comfortable with that. And, this is my culture and you all are my people, and that's fine. And so I was still, in the Mormon world very much. But just like, I don't believe any of this, not a bit of it. And I told my family, my parents, I told people, like, I don't believe this anymore. I am here.
Can I ask how family reacted when you had told them that? Especially those closest to you, your parents, your siblings, your wife, obviously. Like, were those really hard conversations? Did they say, "Oh, we saw this coming," or was it a total shocker to everyone? How did that play out?
Total shocker to everyone. It was not something I really wanted to talk about with people leading up to it. There are a lot of fears you feel as in that position, that you just are really unsure about things. And it was incredibly painful and difficult for my wife. It was very painful for my parents and for siblings. And I will just say, lots of us said things that we regret, and thank God we have repaired those
good
kinds of things at this point. But it's I don't blame anyone. Certainly, it's a very high emotional thing that can feel like it's not just that I'm rejecting the faith. I'm rejecting you because
Absolutely.
I grew up in a family that just, our faith is part of our family. It is part of us. And so, that was a difficult thing for people, and took time to heal, and in some sense is still healing, but it's in a much better place now.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah. And you had noted, I kind of experimented with thinking through other ways of understanding Mormonism. There are a lot of people who have a more kind of liberalized idea about Mormonism. There are people now who believe the Book of Mormon is just, they say, it's just a big piece of pseudepigrapha, and it could still be scripture because, they borrowed heavily from like higher criticism of the Bible, and will say, well, such and such is pseudepigrapha, but it's scripture. So I can say that the Book of Mormon is still scripture, even though it's pseudepigrapha. Like Joseph Smith authored it. There weren't really Nephites or Lamanites. None of that stuff is historically real, but that's not the point, right? The point is kind of the deeper, more spiritualized sense of things. And I worked at that for a little while, but it just is really difficult. It's a really difficult environment to be in. It's very difficult to go to church and hear people say things that are demonstrably false, and to have, in particular, to have your children hearing those things and to be kind of muzzled. It's a very difficult position to be in. And, it just wasn't working. I was very unhappy. I'd started, practicing law out here in DC. It's a very stressful job. And I was just, I was very successful at work, but found that I was unhappy. And my relationship with my wife was good in the sense of, like, we were never in any serious, trouble. Divorce was just never a thing that was ever on our radars ever. But things were tough.
Sure. Yeah.
And there could be conflict sometimes. And at some point, I stumble across some of the writings of John Henry Newman. And I was reading about, in his essay on development of Christian doctrine. I read just the first part and didn't understand it very well, and had kind of the wrong view of it at first, and wasn't thinking about Catholicism. Catholicism was not on my radar. I was thinking more of like, how could I construct a coherent Mormonism that rejects components of its past? And I saw this thing about him like writing about development, and just the notion of development kind of entered my radar. And I was kind of trying to apply that to Mormonism. And again, it just wasn't working because it involved contradiction. It involved saying like, you have to repudiate, you have to say that Joseph Smith was a prophet, but he erred in, his revelation on polygamy, for instance, right? Like that was just wrong. And that's obviously a problem, and not a very sure foundation, intellectually,
to build a
or
church,
as a matter of faith to kind of rest your belief in. And at some point I come across, it's still pretty bit of a mystery to me how I hear about the Apostolic Fathers. I hear that there's this group, I've never heard of them before, and was like, oh, that's interesting. A group of kind of the earliest non-New Testament or post-New Testament Christian writings. I wonder what that's about. That'd be interesting to kind of look at. And I literally had a moment of like, I could pick some few things out of there that I want to believe.
I love it.
Add that to my repertoire, or if not, I won't. And I wound up, they're right here above me.
I was wondering if that was the set. I was looking at that. Yeah, nice.
That's the set.
Because that's the eBay. You got it on eBay for like $236, right?
I got it on eBay for just over $200, which
amazing.
If you go look at what these cost now, sometimes I'll say that alone is proof of God's providence.
Seriously.
In this
world. That was the Holy Spirit right there, paving the way.
So, and I got them, and I said, I don't really care. I like to have a lot of, I got a lot of books on my shelf. I said, I don't really care what happened after that. They're a nice set of books, and I'm not just, they're all here. It's a decent enough price. So I'll buy them, and I wanted to read the Apostolic Fathers. And I sat down and I started to read that first volume with no commentaries, no anything. And again, Catholicism was not really on the radar in any sense. I mean, it had started to creep into the radar. I had a book from Newman and some things like that. But I start reading this, and just bit by bit saw something I hadn't expected. I had fully expected to see something that, in my own judgment, was subject to a lot of debate about what these people are talking about, or what religion this is that these people belong to. And that's not what I found. I started to very quickly have a strong sense that these people were Catholic. And while I didn't see kind of a really like exact one-for-one correlation on every Catholic belief I knew about, or there was, you certainly, not everything the father said is correct.
Sure.
But I just had this very growing sense that the Catholic Church is the historical inheritor of whatever this is. And it wasn't even a position of like, I believe that the Catholic Church is like what God wants me to do, or is instituted by God even. It was simply that it strikes me that Christianity is a thing, and it's this thing. And it's these beliefs that these people hold. One of them in particular that struck me was the belief in the real presence. It just seemed very, very obvious to me from reading these things that these people believe something crazy, believe something totally nutso to me, which was that the Eucharist is, the body and blood of Jesus. And, that one in particular, was something like, I thought, how do I call myself a Christian, or how do I say I believe in Jesus? I believe in the same things that the people who were the earliest people, the people who died in some of these really horrific
Yeah.
martyrdoms and such. How do I identify in any sense with these people if I don't believe this thing? And it
Hmm.
just didn't make sense to me that I could not believe that thing. And it's not that I did believe that early on, but these things just started to kind of compound. And certainly by the time I had read all the way through chronologically, like all the documents up through, near the end of the 2nd century with Saint Irenaeus's Against Heresies, I had become, strongly suspicious that Catholicism might be correct.
Yeah.
And
I love that.
yeah, and at that
That's
point
amazing.
started to really sort of study and think about Catholicism as an option.
Now, I got the sense in your book that there's this, there's this anti-intellectualism in Mormonism, and I don't mean that Mormons don't like to read books or don't like to think. What I mean is that there's a fear on the part of the Mormon Church and on the part of some Mormons that if you scratch too deeply, if you dig too deeply on the claims, you won't like what you find, and the church might crumble for it. I think one of the beautiful things about being Catholic is that we don't have to be afraid of any question. There's no question that, I tell people this, right? There's no question you will think of that someone has not already thought of, and that
And
a
thought about
Catholic
a
has
lot.
not, yeah, and that a Catholic has not already responded to. So it's a great comfort to a Catholic apologist that when you are arguing and someone makes what you think is a really good point that you haven't thought of before, there's an answer for it. You just have to go find it.
Yeah.
And so even when my kids ask really good questions, and they do, I mean, the other day my 7-year-old asked, "Daddy, did Jesus know he was God even when he was a little baby?"
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it's a big question that goes to a lot of things that are pretty central to our faith. And how do we conceive of the incarnation, and what implications does that have for Jesus and his divine knowledge, and what does that say about the fact that he is fully man and fully God? How does that fit into play? So these are complicated questions, but I encourage my kids to ask these questions. I encourage them to play Stump the Teacher if they want to, because these are good questions. And if we truly try to find the answers, there are good answers that are out there. So did you find that in your study of the Fathers when you were reading the Apostolic Fathers? And if so, did you find that encouraging? That it's sort of the opposite mentality. I mean, these guys are obviously incredibly smart writers who are engaging with some of the foremost pagan minds of their day, right, writing against heresies, or Justin Martyr's philosophical dialogues, for example. I mean, and there's rich stuff there, and they are not afraid. They're not afraid to go deep.
Yeah, I think certainly in the Fathers, things that I like along those lines that kind of resonated with me early. I read some stuff that was like out of chronological order. I read parts of the ecumenical councils. I read a lot of Eusebius, and like with respect to the canon and respect to authorship and those sorts of things in the New Testament.
Yeah.
It was just however one comes out on any of these questions, and I'm not really going to opine on that. It was just a breath of fresh air that Eusebius is, talking. He's like, well, some people are really skeptical about Second Peter, and some people totally reject, James or whatever.
Yep.
And nobody's really sure who wrote Hebrews. And some people say it's Barnabas, some people say it's Paul. And it was sort of like, I didn't know the people were thinking about this, or
yes,
or you read Augustine, right? And Augustine's like, Christians should really refrain from making arguments about the literal meanings of Genesis. They should be very cautious about doing some of these things.
Yep.
And so certainly in the Fathers, but more as I read the Fathers and I started to think there might be something to Catholicism. I started watching everything I could, listening to everything I could, and I listened. I watched then Father Robert Barron, now Bishop Robert Barron's Catholicism series from a decade or so ago. A beautiful, beautiful series, and in there, starting to get introduced to to two things: the intellectual tradition of the church and beauty,
Mm-hmm.
and the mystery of Catholicism. And on the intellectual side, Thomas Aquinas and John Henry Newman were really big, I think, influences on me in that. And, again, you want to say, Catholicism is not afraid of the hardest questions. Just to open the Summa to the first part, once St. Thomas tells us, that theology is worth talking about, and you get past that question, you get to these questions about God. And like the first question is, it would seem that there is no God.
Right, right, exactly.
The two most enduring objections to the existence of God that still persists with us today, that being the problem of evil, and the second being that God is not necessary to explain the existence of things.
Yeah.
And then, obviously he uses Augustine's argument to refute the first, and the famous 5 ways on the second. But, that really resonated with me. And it really resonated with me to move from, I had always learned about the nature of God as, Heavenly Father, in the idea of Mormonism, is a man. He's an exalted man who used to not be God and then became God through, following the principles that Mormonism teaches. And we're made in the image of God because we have fingers and toes and eyes and ears, and that's what that means. And
I didn't realize that. Wow.
To move from that to the perennial Christian teaching on what it means to be made in the image of God, immensely evident in the Fathers, right? And in all of the early Christology, the Logos Christology of Justin Martyr and the like, to know that we are made in the image of God because we have a reason. That is what makes us most like God.
Right.
That was really powerful to me because I felt like I was coming from something that had said, no, that's not a good thing in certain cases, right? That's a thing you need to shut off. Whereas I think Catholicism is really like, no, that's a thing that you turn on. And it's a way for us to really experience communion with God. In that sense, maybe I resonate with Dominican spirituality, that studying, questions like that is.
I mean, you'll find no argument from me. The Dominicans are my favorite. Yeah, love them. I've had a ton of Dominicans from the Eastern Province on this show, so yeah, it's great.
And then alongside of that, I just had this sense that's hard to describe of, Mormonism is not Trinitarian. They reject the doctrine of the Trinity. And so that was very foreign to me, but it was very obvious that while the technical language of Trinitarianism takes, centuries to develop.
Yeah.
The notion that the Father is God and that Jesus is God also, but that there's only one God was also coming from somebody who is like not Trinitarian. Reading the early Fathers, you're just like, holy cow. They also, it was not hard for me to accept that the doctrine of the Trinity represents the historic Christian belief. But from that time on, like I said, sort of initially through Bishop Barron's work, there's just a growing sense of getting to know God. Because this God that I'm being introduced to via Catholicism is very different from the God that I had envisaged, that I had grown up believing in a sense. And Jesus was very different than the person that I had held in my mind as Jesus. And that was really powerful and impactful to me. And through the church's liturgy, just blew me away. The mystery of Christian liturgy, coming to understand or just to know like that there is a thing called, I'm not an Eastern Catholic. I was baptized Latin Rite, but I definitely explored Eastern Catholicism early on and was very, drawn to a lot of aspects of Eastern Catholicism. but I had never heard of such a thing. I didn't know
Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
a thing,
We attend the Byzantine Divine Liturgy regularly. So yeah,
It's beautiful,
love it.
beautiful. So, those things kind of pushed me along to where I eventually, I went to a mass, experienced the liturgy, and I was, I'd been studying, I think, for something like a year, give or take, on my own before I
Hmm.
ever went to a mass, and went to mass for a few months before I ever talked to the priest and introduced myself. And then once I did, I said, I think I want to become Catholic, and, went from there.
Now we've already talked about this feeling of certitude that you had as a Mormon, and that Mormons really emphasize. When you went to mass for the first time, or even in any successive time, did you have a similar experience? And if so, did you sort of have to check yourself and be like, wait a minute, I know that this feeling is not everything. This feeling cannot tell me what is true. You know what I mean?
Yeah. The first time, no. Have I had, have I become emotional during the liturgy? Yes. The first time, I think the first time I heard the Scola chant Veni, Veni, Emmanuel during Advent just rocked my world. I was alone, right? I don't have my family with me. The biggest struggle for me, most of my discussions with the priest were not doctrinal in nature. They were pastoral in nature. How am I supposed to
Yeah.
deal with the fact that I'm the father of a family and my wife and my
Yeah.
children are all
That's tough.
LDS?
So
How do
hard.
I deal with this?
Yeah.
But I just never, I was just not thinking at all that I was praying a lot and praying for God to help me, and to the Blessed Mother to help me to understand how to know if this is the right thing to do, but not looking and not expecting some kind of manifestation, because that's just not the way
Feeling.
Catholicism works. It's an interesting thing when you
Right.
talk to a lot of Mormons. They will be under the impression that this is how everyone works, that like everyone believes their religion is true because they've had some kind of internal experience. And I do think that there's some truth to that, especially in American churches. And there are lots of evangelical circles that are like that, right?
Yes.
That that your faith is tied to this emotive experience. But I just, I'm probably, I don't pay attention to my feelings and emotions to a fault still, as a reactive
Yeah.
position. And
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
it was just not the way, I was looking at Catholicism to decide whether I thought it was true. I honestly just sat down and said, I'm looking at everything, and do I believe this is true? Is there enough here for me to assent, uh, to believe it's true, and to assent to the things that I obviously don't know, because I have to assent to the entirety of the Catholic faith in order to be a Catholic. And you reach that level, and I don't know how to. There's nothing like extraordinary, no like wham bam moment or anything like that. It's simply a matter of, I read my way into the church, and maybe my faith is over intellectualized. I will accept that criticism, but that's really how I came in. That, and
Yeah.
when I have become emotional, I think I tell a vignette in the book about, during Bishop Barron's one of his episodes. He has an episode where he shows the Pietà, Michelangelo's Pietà, and I became really emotional when I saw
Hmm.
it. But I had this sense of like, I'm not emotional because it's Jesus, or I'm not emotional because it's the Blessed Mother crying over her son. I'm emotional because this is beautiful. I'm looking at something that is
Yeah.
objectively beautiful. Like it is beautiful. And that points me to something beyond, right? The
Yes.
existence of objective beauty points us to something beyond material reality. And and I think, it's more an indication, yeah, we cry at things, we get moved by things, and we should think about why that is. And I thought about why am I crying at this? And the answer is it's beautiful. There's something very beautiful about this. And to think more about the question of beauty led me back into this idea of, that God, as the Catholic Church tells me he exists. This idea in Augustine that, our hearts are restless until they rest in God, that it points to something beyond material reality.
We could talk for hours about that idea alone. I'm firmly convinced that our world suffers from a severe deficit of beauty, and that deficit of beauty contributes to a whole host of problems. Primarily, our lack of belief in God, and then a whole host of others besides. But I think I'm glad that you had that encounter with the via pulchritudinis through the work of Bishop Barron. I hear he talks about that a lot, but I'm a strong supporter of the strong believer in the idea that we need more people creating beautiful art, because it does point us to the transcendent, points us to some objective reality beyond ourselves. Going back to this idea of the postmodern sort of self-referential idea of truth, beauty shows us that's actually not the case, right? There is an objective. There's an objective thing beyond us, and beauty points us to that. So I think it's great. Yeah. We're about out of time, Jeremy, but I noticed you have a lot of, I don't think he's come up yet tonight. I haven't heard you say his name, but you have a lot of sentences dedicated to St. Thomas More, and you found this man as a compelling figure even in your law school days. I have to ask, he's my confirmation saint. I have to ask, is he your confirmation saint as well?
He is.
Nice.
I think St. Thomas More is somebody that I have a sense has been involved in my life for a long time. And I've always been very compelled by his figure, more so, studying who he kind of really is, and less the Paul Scofield rendition in A Man for All Seasons, although I love that movie. It's a wonderful movie. But I have a strong devotion to Thomas More. As a lawyer, he's a patron saint of lawyers and statesmen, and I ask for his intercession.
Very devoted father as well.
Yes, very devoted father. And an ideal saint for a lay man, right? That he was called to the vocation of marriage, and was a really good example in that. And so yes, I have a very strong devotion to him, and have just had that sense for some time. But yeah, he's my confirmation saint.
I love it. Well, we're confirmation saint brothers then. Jeremy, thanks so much for joining me today on the show. Really appreciate you taking the time to share your journey. Doubly appreciate you writing this book, because I think this is going to be a great resource for people like yourselves who are like yourself, who are Mormon, perhaps considering becoming ex-Mormon, questioning, is this true? And I think your memoir really goes far in helping people sort of see a way out of that. And then you spend a good amount of time also sort of defending the truth of Christianity, and especially through the lens of the Apostolic Fathers. So, highly recommend this book to all of my listeners. From the Susquehanna to the Tiber, a memoir of conversion from Mormonism to the Roman Catholic Church by Jeremy Christiansen. Jeremy, thanks so much for joining me once again. To my listeners, if you have questions for Jeremy, I would be happy to pass them along. So send me a note, Zach, Z-A-C, at creedalpodcast.com. And thanks for listening. Until next time, God bless you.